begins with fermentation. During this initial stage, a special slurry is prepared by precisely blending water, yeast, and a small amount of dough conditioners. This slurry is prepared on a carefully scheduled basis and stored in a refrigerated slurry hold tank at 40 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. This temperature ensures that the yeast will remain inactive. The process continues when the slurry is metered into a high-speed mixing device known as the sponge maker. Flour and water are now added to form the sponge, or broth. This 50% flour liquid sponge is then pumped to the fermenter, where it is conditioned through yeast fermentation. During this phase, the yeast ferments sugars in the flour, giving off carbon dioxide, alcohol, and acids to create distinctive flavors. Carbon dioxide gas, or CO2, formed in this stage, is also responsible for leavening or raising the product during the later proofing and baking stages. In addition, this CO2 gas expansion stretches the flour protein known as gluten, making the dough more pliable and expandable for baking. During this process, the sponge temperature increases approximately 10 degrees Fahrenheit. After nearly 2.5 hours of fermentation, the now fermented sponge is transferred through a heat exchanger to a holding tank. This reduces the sponge temperature down to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, deactivating the yeast, while the sponge awaits its trip to the mixer. Prior to final mixing, a variety of smaller ingredients are added. The mixer operator loads milk, bran, germ, syrups, and other nourishing ingredients directly into the front of the bread mixer. Pre-measured bulk ingredients, the sponge, and additional flour are also brought together automatically. The final batch is then pumped directly into a 2,400-pound capacity mixer. The mixing process begins slowly, allowing dry ingredients to hydrate and blend smoothly. Then the mixer switches to high speed, where the rapid action of the mixer arms expand and knead the dough. This further develops the gluten, so that it can be stretched into a thin membrane without breaking apart. Since this gluten development process occurs faster without salt, it is not added until the later stages of mixing. After approximately 19 minutes, an 1,100 to 2,400 pound dough mound is discharged from the mixer into a special trough. Following a 5 to 20 minute rest period, the huge mound of dough is hoisted in the trough to a hopper located high above the divider. Gravity then moves the dough into the divider, where a ram device forces it into 6 individual pockets, preset to receive a specific dough volume. Once inside these divider pockets, a knife cuts the dough, enabling it to drop onto the conveyor below. Since the scaling weight may vary with each baking product, the pocket size is adjusted to increase or decrease the volume as required. Scaled dough pieces next travel by conveyor to the rounder. As they move around the rounder cone, they are shaped into a ball, and a protective skin forms on the outside. This prevents CO2 gas from escaping during the next phase. Upon leaving the rounder, the dough now enters an intermediate proofer. Having lost much of the CO2 gas during the dividing process, the dough pieces need to spend 6 minutes in this area where they can relax before molding. This step ensures that the dough will be soft and pliable, making it easy to shape without tearing. The individual dough pieces next move to the molder. They are first sheeted out or flattened, passing through 2 sets of rollers. This procedure breaks up any large pockets of gas and also creates the fine texture found in each finished loaf. After flattening, the dough travels under the pressure board to remove any remaining gas pockets during the formation of the cylindrical loaf. Each loaf is then deposited into pans and sent on to the final proofer. Final proofing is conducted in a carefully controlled environment, featuring temperatures ranging from 100 to 105 degrees Fahrenheit, with a relative humidity of 90%. The dough remains here for about an hour, allowing the yeast fermentation process to continue producing large amounts of CO2. This ongoing fermentation process causes the dough to expand to proper baking size. As dough leaves the proofer on its way to the oven, A variety of procedures take place depending on the type of bread produced. Seeding, splitting, or placement of lids for baking square bread occurs during this phase of the process. The loaves now travel into the oven, where they will bake for 19 to 23 minutes at temperatures from 390 to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. The precise time and temperature selected depends on the bread variety being baked. Following completion of the baking process, the pans of hot bread are ejected from the oven onto a conveyor. Before the breads enter the cooling area, they must be removed from the pans. And since the square bread variety is covered, pan lids must first be lifted. This is accomplished using a special magnetic conveyor system. Once the lids are off, the oven-fresh loaves are pulled from their pans with special rubber suction cups. The rubber cups in this unique vacuum system stick to the bread, gently lifting each loaf and placing it on a conveyor running to the cooler. Once in the cooler, the internal temperature of the bread is reduced from approximately 200 degrees Fahrenheit to approximately 100 degrees Fahrenheit. This important temperature reduction prevents the loaves from tearing when sliced. Care must also be taken not to cool the loaves too much, since this would dry out the bread and affect overall quality. Each loaf of Mayor's bread is now ready to be sliced, bagged, and loaded for delivery. The loaves are precisely sliced by continuous band slicers, producing individual bread slices ranging from 7/16 to 1 inch in thickness. Then, they are individually bagged to ensure freshness. Prior to inserting the bread, each bag is accurately stamped with a price and sale date code. A jet stream of air now fully inflates the bag, allowing it to be easily pulled on the loaf. The bags are then securely twist-tied closed and given a final visual inspection before being hand-stacked in trays for shipment.